Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
1 second. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone from around the world. I would like to welcome everyone to the BCI UAE chapter webinar of the impact supply chain in the Middle East due to geopolitical situations. I'll basically just quickly share my screen. Can everybody see my screen? All right.
Yes.
So for today's agenda, basically this is today's agenda. We'll be basically starting with our first speaker, with Mr. Talal, and then our next speaker, Mr. Kursad, and then of course the Q&A would be in the end. So basically, before we begin, first of all, sorry guys, I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm your host, Suzanne Al-Ghanem, along with my colleague, Mr. Carlo Lovera. We are members of the BCI UAE chapter. And before we begin, we would like
good
to...
afternoon.
Good afternoon.
No, so just say good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon, like in the UAE. So before we begin our webinar, everyone, we would like to remind everyone, if you have any questions, any inquiries, please post it in the chat. So at least all of your questions and inquiries will be answered by the end of this webinar. And in addition, we'll be posting a satisfaction survey so that you'll be able to receive your certificate of participation. And now we're basically going to, before we hand over to the speaker, our first speaker is a returning speaker since last year. He has over 18 years of expertise and experience in the field of the enterprise risk management, business resilience, organization resilience, information security, disaster recovery, crisis management, emergency, and of course, business continuity within and working within the Middle East. He is the SVP Business and Cyber Resilience and Enterprise Risk MENA, working at Marsh Advisory. So I'd like to introduce you guys to Mr. Talal Darras. So Mr. Talal, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's a pleasure to be on the call today, and looking forward to some interesting discussions towards the end of this webinar. Just to double check, my screen is good. Are we good to go?
Definitely. We can see your screen.
Perfect. Okay, excellent. So I think the topic today is very interesting, and I'm sure anyone in the risk management, business continuity, resilience field, it is a top concern to many of the C-suite that we speak to. The impact of supply chain and supply chain resilience. The actual facts are, we used to have a major global supply chain problem pre-COVID. It wasn't talked about a lot. It was a key element of concern. Capacity problems in ports, suppliers not able to have enough supply, transport of goods and services was a bit cheaper when compared today, but there was a slight issue pre-COVID. COVID, of course, made it a bit worse. It magnified the actual threat and risk around supply chain. The current geopolitical situation globally and regionally in the region here in the Middle East is also having a drastic impact on supply chain, impacting multiple industries. So these are the points of discussion that we'll be talking about today. Usually I like to conduct workshops where there's a lot of Q&A, and you can interrupt me and stop me to talk about stuff, and we discuss, argue, convince each other, but hopefully we'll have a chance to do that towards the end of the session. So if we talk about some of the golden era days and how the developments in the late 20th century in supply chain. So let's go back a little bit. So we used to see stability in trade barriers. We used to see more transport of goods around the world. We used to see easing of transport of goods, even though there was some geopolitical stability or instability in some parts of the world. There was a lot of improvements in container shipping. Ports are getting bigger, vessels are getting even bigger. There is an increase in freight transport globally. Percentages in the US are up to 45 to 55% in freight transport only in the US. And you see borders opening up in this part of the world as well, in the Middle East, North Africa, GCC, where there's more increase in freight transport. Vessels, if you compare vessels 20 years ago and today, they're almost double the size, carrying more containers, more automobiles, more wheat, more crude oil, and it's making things a bit more easier when it comes to transportation of goods. Ports are also getting bigger and bigger. Berths are getting bigger to manage the types of vessels that are coming in and out of these ports. When we talk about some of the disruptions, the ecosystem is huge and it's very complicated. And there's a lot of things that can impact supply chains globally. So if we talk about pre-pandemic, these are some of the incidents that happened. When we talk about the US and China trade war, and it's still happening today. Some people say the actual war happening today between Russia and Ukraine is also linked to this global power talking to each other. But the session today is not about politics. It's about what is the impact on me? What is the impact on you? What is the impact on your industry? So the trade war has been there, and there was a huge cost element to the US and of course to China because of the impact of what's happened. When we talk about natural disasters, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico had a major impact on not just that part of the world in Central America, but it also had a big impact on South America and North America. And if you recall, when Hurricane Maria hit, it took FEMA some time to mobilize and provide support. And we're talking about 2017. We're not talking about Hurricane Katrina 15 years ago. We're talking about Puerto Rico 2017. And imagine if you want to compare Katrina to Puerto Rico or Katrina to Maria, there's a big difference. You would assume the response time, the capabilities, air cargo, manpower, soldiers on the ground, boots on the ground to support, Coast Guard, military, police. You would assume things get better with time. But all of this is learning. Governments are learning, industries are learning, organizations are learning, and we as individuals also have to learn. Because there's an element on us personally, even with our families, when we talk about stuff like this. If we talk about the 2018 trucker strike in India, where it had a major halt in freight transport, and it took them 8 days to resolve it. So all of these are key examples on how pre-COVID, it's an environment suited for disruption. I'm sure you've heard about the NatPati ransomware attack, and this was 2017. We are still hearing a lot of similar, interesting, I call them interesting because it's learning. You learn when an incident happens. Interesting cyber attacks that are happening globally. Unfortunately, it takes an incident, it takes a death, it takes an injury of people, it takes negative reputation impact for organizations to wake up and say, you know what, I need to fix something, I need to invest, I need to focus my efforts on cyber resilience, on incident response, on emergency response. Why wait for a death to happen? Why wait for a cyber attack to happen? Why wait to reach level 5 in your impact matrix on reputation where there's negative impact on your name, on your brand name? You have to invest today. You have to implement solutions today. You have to embed supply chain resilience into your programs, cyber resilience as well. You have to know what your threats are. You have to know what the emerging threats that are happening today. You need to know what your threat that you're going to face 5 years down the road based on what your strategy says and how that will impact your decision-making process today. So all of these are key incidents that we have to learn from, and we have to read about, we have to understand, comprehend. So if we talk about some of the ones that happened either during COVID or some people would say post-COVID. In this part of the world, I can say it's post-COVID, but when you go back to the Far East, they're still in COVID. So I could say we are still during COVID globally. The 2021 Suez Canal blockade and how that had a major impact on global operations. Imagine one vessel, one major incident in Egypt that impacted the global operations. Anyways, pre-COVID, Suez Canal was very delayed. You had to wait for weeks and weeks to get access to it and to get priority to go in. Post this, it was even a bigger problem. The 2021 problem in US ports, which is a very difficult problem to resolve because you have different parties, you have the authority, you have the government in place, you have the unions of the people, you have the fact that some of the ports are not 24/7 operations, you have the fact that the vessels are getting bigger and there are no containers that they're being stuck because the vessels come in, they drop the containers, they're not being processed by the port, they're not being processed to leave the port to their final destinations. They're not being put on freight trucks or trains to leave, and there's nothing to come back on. The empty containers are not able to come back. So there's a shortage of containers globally. Even when the US president interfered in 2021 with the executive decision, it still didn't help a lot. Even when you say, okay, let's operate the port 24/7, activate X, Y, and Z, it helps. But at the end of the day, the model is very complicated when it comes to the US. It's a bit simpler in other parts of the world, but you still have to face some of these consequences. If you guys recall, the cargo ship that had approximately 400 cars on it, and it caught fire, and there was an estimated value of $401 million. If you remember when they brought in that vessel to one of the ports, and you could see like 200 cars coming out of it, which were never caught fire, and everything else was gone. So how did this have an impact to European dealerships? How did it have an impact to the actual fact that today automobiles, we have already a problem with automobile dealerships, at least in Middle East and North Africa, if we want to focus on that. Why? It's because of the major chip problem globally. Manufacturers buy chip from China. They need that chip and other semiconductors and other items to complete manufacturing of an automobile. So I'm a dealership in the UAE, and I usually order 400 cars every 2 months. If today I put an order for 200 cars, the dealer would tell me, I can only give you 20. I can only give you 40. I don't have capacity. I don't have cars. Also, they're not giving the dealerships flexibility on options and colors, which is also making it difficult for the end user. So when we talk about some of the global problems happening globally and how it's impacting us locally in this part of the world, these are the key examples that we're talking about. There's also the 2020 Philippines congestion at Manila Port. It used to happen pre-COVID. It's just getting more complex, more problematic, and with no major incidents, there's heavy delays. Imagine if there's an incident, imagine if there's an accident, imagine if there's an impact on some of these container ships. The cyber attack on the fuel supplier company in Germany in 2022 is another major. You know, the introduction of smart connected cities, smart technology, and robotics, smart cities, all of these are the technologies of the future, but it's also allowing more backdoors to be open for cyber attacks. There's the heavy reliance on technology, smart ports, the fact that you're embedding operational technology into everything that we do. You probably have OT at home and you're not aware about it. So this is exactly what we talk about when we need to be aware of your risks. You need to understand your risks. You need to be able to mitigate as much as you can. To top tier executives, to C-suite personnel, this is the cost. You are a cost to the organization. But when the organization is more mature, they understand risk management, business continuity, resilience, cybersecurity, that it's not just a cost. Because the reputation impact could be $20 million, but you implementing effective, robust solution could cost you $200,000 or $500,000. So this is where we always pitch to our clients, talk about risks, embed risk into your decision-making process. Make sure it's part of your discussions at the C-suite. Make sure it's part of your strategy discussions. A recent client that I was working with in the aviation sector in this part of the world, one of the key risks we talk about, will you even exist in 2 years? With the fact that there's heavy competition in the region, the fact that the government is opening more for competitors to start doing business, the fact that margins are getting lower and lower and your revenues are getting less and less. Will you exist in 2 to 5 years? Do you have to diversify today to be able to exist and make more profit and more revenue? So those are key discussion points that every C-suite have to discuss, every risk manager has to talk about, and every risk committee have to also think about. So what you have in front of you now is a report that Marshall McLennan writes with the World Economic Forum, and it's a yearly report that comes out, and it's the global risk report. And if we talk about which of these top risks would impact supply chain to you, to your industry, climate action failure. You think heavy rain will impact your supply chain? A hurricane, hail, snow, extreme temperatures, fog, all of this will impact what we are doing today. So these are extreme weather events. The fact that the water level in ports is changing because of climate change. Is that climate action failure? That we're not doing enough to improve? Everyone is talking about ESG these days. It used to be called sustainability. It used to be called environment. Now, then it jumped into sustainability. Now it's ESG. 2 years down the road, they'll call it something else. It's a key top risk to any industry these days. If you look at petrochemicals, if you look at oil and gas, power, they all talk about ESG. So many of these risks impact directly and indirectly to supply chains. The geopolitical tensions that are also happening have a big, heavy impact on supply chains. And we'll talk about some of these examples in the next couple of slides. But you need to understand the different elements of supply chain. It's not just a chip for an automobile. It's not just yogurt coming in from another country or cheese coming in from another country. It's the basics of wheat, for example, that we have a problem with in some parts of the world. It's a problem of children's milk. It's a problem of Pampers for kids. So it's not just your industry and the part that you need for a pump in a petrochemical plant, or a valve that you need for your car, or an equipment, a certain part for an airplane that's not available. It drills down to actual real-life examples that can impact us as people and families as well. If we talk about some of the impact on supply chains from a geopolitical standpoint, and some of the things we need to talk about in the Russia-Ukraine crisis that is ongoing right now. There's, of course, the safety and well-being of refugees and the movement of refugees from that part of the world to Europe and in many cases somewhere else. The rising prices for essentials. I can tell you personally, I can see a rise in the price of gas. I can see a rise in grocery shopping. And I'm sure many industries can see a higher cost element to what we're doing. Imagine you're a small to medium-sized enterprise and you buy your raw materials from China. You do something with it, you manufacture something with it, and you sell it. If the cost of transportation of your raw materials is tenfold what it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and the cost for you to ship it from your location to the distributor or to the final customer is also double today. Imagine, will the customer still have the money to buy it? If you look at luxury brands, it's a different story. They don't have a lot of supply, yet they're selling left, right, and center. And you go to the showrooms of some of these luxury brands, let's take watches and Rolex. You don't have them. You can't find them. You go to AP showroom, they tell you we don't have any watches. So luxury brands is a very unique thing that maybe had a positive impact on supply chain when we talk about the geopolitical risks and maybe COVID. But other industries were heavily impacted. Oil, wheat, rye, all of these have heavily changed in pricing. So the dynamics of putting a price, a selling price to a product is changing rapidly, which means you have to become more resilient, which means you have to factor that in, which means you have to ensure that your existence, that you exist in a couple of years. Rising transportation costs is another element that we spoke about, and it will continue to rise. We don't see any, we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel when we talk about transportation costs. Cyber vulnerabilities. I mean, it's cyber warfare between countries is one thing. The fact that countries are also utilizing their cyber expertise to attack industries elsewhere is a bigger problem. I met a client once and they said, yeah, everything is stable now in X part of the world, and there's no impact on the geopolitical front. There's a minor impact on my business. That's never the case. Even if it's stable today, will it be stable tomorrow? Do we know it's going to be stable tomorrow? No one knows. No one knows. And key examples in GCC, key examples in Middle East and North Africa, and globally. I mean, even now, the issue between Russia and Ukraine, although there were implied messages that it will happen, no one took it seriously. So we just need to be careful. We need to ensure we're understanding our risk and ensure that we're taking the effective decision-making when it comes to supply chain and making it more resilient. Let's talk about food prices. And I guarantee you, the wheat problem is one of the top items being discussed by any minister around the world, because it's the responsibility of the government to ensure there is wheat available for the end user, the consumer. So this is the key example of reliance on one country for wheat, and how today the tensions that are happening between Russia and Ukraine is allowing shortages in this part of the world. Did we think about alternatives before? Did we think about buying it from multiple countries? Did we think about maybe there's a cost element to buying it from another country other than Ukraine, but at least I am resilient? Did we think about the actual storage and increase the storage? Did we anticipate this happening? Maybe some people anticipated the war or the conflict to happen, but did they anticipate the impact on wheat to their local markets? Probably not. So this is the forward looking. This is being proactive in the decision-making process. If we take Egypt as an example, 70% of the wheat in Egypt comes from Russia and Ukraine. 80% of the grains in Tunisia come from the same countries. Lebanon imports 60% of its wheat from Ukraine. Imagine the impact. And we're not talking about price. The price has gone up 35% since the conflict arose. So these are key real-life examples today where we see a problem and where we see governments' impact on the end user and the local consumer. And these are some interesting figures for you guys. The top wheat exporters and importers. So notice the biggest exporters of wheat: Russia at 37, Ukraine at 18. So you're talking about 50% of the wheat comes from two countries globally when it comes to export. Look at the imports. Look at the percentages on the imports. Very interesting data. And this is, by the way, from 2020. If you look at the left-hand side and the reasons for the Middle East countries to worry about Ukraine crisis: wheat, energy, military presence, and security. There's always an impact on what's happening globally to your local industry, to your product, to your end user, to your service. So if we want to talk a little bit on some of the dynamics around supply chain and logistics, these are some key facts on some of the commercial ports in UAE, South Africa, in Egypt. And it talks about how the numbers are getting bigger and bigger. The capacity of ports is also growing rapidly. And let me just double check. You guys still see my screen? Now I'm getting used to this new, yeah, you can see it?
Yeah, we can definitely see it. But you're doing good.
Okay, perfect.
You're definitely doing great, Talal.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. So the port capacities are actually growing rapidly. And if you notice, there's a lot of company names here, and this is public information from Factiva and Forbes. But you can notice how companies are actually growing in number and the diversification of businesses. So take DP World as an example. They're moving into logistics. They're moving into not just being a port operator. Why is that? They're also moving into other industries that are not port related. So this is exactly some examples where you can also take ownership of the full overall supply chain process. You can take ownership of the different levels that are happening within the supply chain, which hopefully will make it easier for the end user. So I just want to talk to you a little bit in the interest of time on some of the ESG related items. And the Global Risk Report talks a lot about climate change, talks a lot about how organizations and businesses and governments are not taking climate change into account in their strategic thinking. They're not resolving or implementing solutions to enhance the overall process of climate change not happening or climate change mitigations. So I think these are very important items. ESG, we've seen a lot in different industries being a top priority, and it is important to embed ESG into supply chain, because you need to understand what your environmental risks are, because you don't want to be hit with the reputational impact on environment for you to stop operations, and that will impact your supply chain. So everything is linked. Cybersecurity, information security, cyber resilience, supply chain, suppliers, reliance on third parties, reliance on specific suppliers. ESG is all impacting the overall supply chain process. You want to become more efficient. You want to become more resilient. You have the adoption of new technologies and the technologies of the future, and blockchain, and the path towards sustainability. All of those have an impact on supply chain. So if we want to talk about some of the recent developments in digitization and how you can see companies investing differently and embedding innovation as part of their process. To what extent is that enabling supply chain resilience? To what extent is a port having their own blockchain to manage the overall digital supply chain platform and process, to make it easier to the end user? All of these are real life examples that showcase how companies, governments, organizations are evolving. And I want to stress on the word evolve, because when you have a people, when you have processes, and when you have technologies that are able to evolve and change, that means you are more resilient than other organizations. Because you have to evolve to manage and mitigate future risks. You have to evolve and mitigate emerging risks. And these are key examples on how this can impact your overall supply chain, and how something happening in 2,000 miles away can impact your operation locally in this part of the world. Just in the interest of time, I would like to talk more about how we can reinforce supply chain and how to ensure supply chain resilience. So we spoke about the global threats on supply chain. We spoke about the political element and how that impacts people, industries, processes, organizations. What's the solution? So these are, I think, 4 elements that every C-suite should think about. 4 elements that every risk manager, business continuity manager should always think about. Number 1, visibility. You need to be able to know what's happening in your supply chain. You need to be able to know who are the critical suppliers. You need to understand every single detail of what's happening, not just where the raw material comes from, where that raw material is coming from, which port, from which manufacturing plant, and what are the dynamics of that company. Because that small company in China that produces X can impact you today. So having visibility across the overall supply chain, the details around it, the risks around it, identification of mitigations, alternate suppliers, supplier 1, supplier 2, supplier 3. So how fast can you change a supplier? Do you need to have a different contractor, a call-off contract with them? All of these are examples of visibility. You need to be on top of this. Collaboration is number 2. You need to be able to effectively communicate and collaborate with the people you're working on from a supply chain perspective. Number 1, let's talk about collaboration internally within the organization. How many times does risk department speak to supply chain? How many times does finance speak to supply chain? How many times does legal or procurement talk about contracts of third parties with operations. I can tell you for a fact, many organizations don't even know that they have a single supplier and there are no business continuity clauses. They tell you, yeah, there's a penalty clause. Well, what's the penalty of $50,000 or $200,000 if you're not able to produce a product? What's the penalty of $100,000 if you're not able to satisfy your customer needs and your customer goes to the competition? So having the ability to work effectively internally and externally with suppliers. And you have to understand the whole supply chain. You have to talk to your shipping companies. You have to have alternate contracts in place. You need to activate those contracts. You need to ensure the lead time on those contracts. All of these are critical elements that you need to think about, strategize, and implement. Flexibility is number 3. Being able to adapt quickly. If we talk about the word quickly, all of us adapted to COVID. All of us, people-wise, families, kids, elderly, had to adapt to COVID. Organizations, small, medium, large enterprises, had to adapt to COVID. Governments had to adapt to COVID. But each person, each organization, each industry coped and managed and responded differently when it comes to COVID. And it shows you people, process, technology. To what extent are those 3 adaptable in your organization? To what extent are those 3 effective enough to change? How reluctant are you as human beings to change? You need to be flexible. You need to embed flexibility in your supply chain. You need to embed flexibility in your manufacturing plant. You need to embed flexibility in your operations. Without that, you can't say you're resilient. Number 4 is control. It's my favorite. What do we mean by control? This is a continuous process. You can't do it and stop. You always have to continue with the visibility, with the collaboration, with the flexibility. The risks are changing. The impact is also changing. The people are changing. The processes are changing. You always have to continue the cycle. It's a never-ending cycle. I think I would like to end with this, with a slide where I think is the solution to many of the supply chain resilience problems that we have. I hope it was an interesting presentation, and I look forward to some interesting questions towards the end of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Talal, for your wonderful presentation. It's a great start, for our webinar. So now we would like to, hang on a second, sorry. Yep. Just before we introduce, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. So our next guest speaker has 15 years of experience in the field and the line of information security, organizational resilience, supply chain, and business continuity in Europe and within the Middle East. He is the head of Digital Trust Assurance, MEA, and working for BSI Middle East. So would like to welcome Mr. Kursad.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead. The floor is yours, Mr. Kursad.
Thank you very much, dear Susan. Let me have a quick setting here. Okay, here we go. Thank you everyone for your valuable time, and thank you for being here to discuss on today's subject, which I will be presenting on essentials of supply chain continuity management within the UAE, in fact. So let me pull this part here. Okay. All right. Now, let's start with an overview of supply chain management within UAE. According to Ministry of Economy, we can also see some opportunities and risks here. The recent trends are UAE has transformed from a logistic hub into a supply chain hotspot in recent years. And I believe many organizations here see that effect every day within their operations. And the localization by many in different organizations in different industries are moving to UAE itself. So localization is possible. That also mitigates the risk of having suppliers overseas. And the growth opportunities here, according to Ministry of Economy, the businesses are looking to shorten and diversify supply chains to build greater supply chain security and resilience. Resilience will be one of the important part of my discussion also. And development of a regional storage hub, allowing nearby nations to secure supply chains and allowing suppliers to maintain demand. Increasing dependence on robotics and automation. This will be also, we will be discussing as separately, digitalization of supply chain management in one of these today's discussions. So, what are some of the supply chain risks for UAE consumers? I would like to talk about first the effects on the end users. These statistics are taken from 2020, where COVID-19 was at the peak of it. So, according to that research done by Oracle, 85% of people have been negatively impacted by supply chain issues over the 2020. And 36% of them were unable to purchase certain items due to shortage, and 37% of them had to cancel their orders. So this caused an anxiety, in fact, among the consumers. 28% of them say they are fear of running. They have a fear of running of essentials and important items that they need to survive, in fact. Now, another one relevant to consumers, a search from KPMG, increasing delivery lead times for essential food items, especially from 1 to 3 days to 5 to 10 days, causing high levels of consumer dissatisfaction. I believe everyone who was living during the COVID-19 time in the region have experienced that. Of course, that was a global crisis that's affecting, but can this be an excuse for organizations to have these delays and reflect it to their consumers? If we have a robust supply chain continuity management, we can mitigate these risks. At least we can reduce these percentages and these days of delivery. So another thing I would like to discuss here is the due diligence and risk assessment of supply chain management, specifically in the UAE, in fact. First of all, one of the risks is who are we working with? Only the price or the speed will not be the reason to choose a supplier, especially when we are operating in UAE. There is an example here. We can understand who's our partners thanks to a document that we can find in the Emirate Department of Economic Development Register. So instead of having our own due diligence, own research, we can rely on this document and we can mitigate the risks to work with an unknown organization. Another one is the payment regime. Now here I also want to go with that example. In the UAE context, an organization had committed a crime in the past. So we should not be working with that organization, and the payment regime may change according to organization's history also. Like here is talking about the historically paid commission. It can be relevant to bribery, for example, to a third party, and we might be working with this organization just because of other reasons, like I said, the financial or the speed reasons. So we need to be careful again when choosing our supplier, and the payment regime will be based on that, as there may be a penal code, a violation of a penal code in this procurement process. The other one is the trade risk. So there is also another interesting example here about the trade risk. I would like to go through that one. Some products such as fire safety equipment can only be imported into the UAE by 100% locally owned businesses. If we are not aware of that, the goods that we are importing or maybe exporting also may be at risk on that one, and it may cause a disruption in our supply chain. So these are basically the three risks within the context of UAE with some examples. Now, going forward, what can be the three supply chain threats and opportunities? As we know, risk can be negative or positive. we will first start with opportunity, but also I would like to say that these opportunities and threats may change according to the context of the organization, but these can be named as the ones that we generally see within the context of UAE. The opportunities of course, organizations operating in UAE has a huge advantage because of the geopolitical location. Just like Minister of Economy mentioned, UAE is becoming a global hub for supply chain management also, and for many business, so organizations can get benefit from these opportunity. The other ones are the seaports and airports above the world standards that we are having within UAE, and the skilled force increasing in years within the UAE as it is attracting many professionals from all around the world and a very suitable place to work and live. But what are the threats on the other hand? Still, there is a huge amount of reliance on international suppliers, which we can say the overseas. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe many organizations are suffered from that. And today, as we are experiencing, for example, the chip crisis, and a good example is what happened to Apple. For the first time, they had to present their new iPhone, not in September, but they shifted 1 month to October. That was the effect globally. And we are also carrying a part of this risk within UAE. The other one is well-known environmental factors that may affect the work times of people, especially in the summer season, like the heat, for example, and the global increasing cost in supply chain, especially that the organizations start to realize at the beginning of 2022, and it is increasing all around the world, the cost. It is also affecting us also, even again, it's a global issue. Other than these opportunities and threats, we also need to discuss about the digitalization. Digitalization can be a threat for an organization if they are falling short to catch the trends. Also, it can be an opportunity for an organization to simplify their processes and provide their customers, which can be business to business or business to customers, consumers, with a quicker response and a more reliable and manageable supply chain, in fact. So digitalization is in the agenda of many executive level managers nowadays, but the issue there is we also need to think about the correct time to catch the digitalization. Again, we need to remember that every organization has a different context. So even it is a trend now, it may not be suitable for our organization to go through the digitalization, or we call it digital transformation, DX or DT. We also need to catch the correct time. Again, that can be an important part of organizational resilience. Also, I would like to add one more sentence about digitalization. As we know, for the last a few decades, we are in Industry 4.0. And no one knows, we just have assumptions about that, but no one knows when will be the next big technological wave, like Industry 5.0. If we are falling short from digitalization in the correct time, if we cannot move to digitalization, I mean, in the context of supply chain management, of course, then we may also miss that trend, and we may lose our compatibility with our suppliers, in fact. Okay, the next one is, what is supply chain continuity management? I will present some definitions from the international standards, specifically from ISO 22318 standard. Now, supply chain continuity management is application of business continuity management to a supply chain. But what is business continuity management? Business continuity management is purely about products and services. There is also a confusion which we have been realizing while having training courses or audits or other relevant works. People tend to think that business continuity can be applied to a specific supporting department like IT or finance for a manufacturing organization, in fact. This is called service continuity. Business continuity is always about delivery of products and services. So it has a very close relation with supply chain management. A robust supply chain management is supporting a process for the entire and the robust business continuity management. That's why they have a very close relation, in fact. So going forward, what are the benefits of supply chain, specifically continuity management? Now, first of all, it helps us to have a better understanding of the supply chain, the areas of the supply chain, or we also call it having an X-ray of our process, which activities are having an interaction with which activity, and we can also understand our potential threats, because in the heart of supply chain continuity management, like almost all the processes, we have the risk management. That is the driver in the supply chain continuity management. So improved response to supply chain disruptions. How? We will be having business continuity plans, which are modified or which are supported by supply chain. So we will be prepared for any disruption, in fact, that is coming or that is on the road or that is in the horizon. Identification and mitigation of supply chain risks before they happen or before the organization is impacted. As we just discussed, risk management is in the heart of supply chain continuity management. So yes, definitely, we are expecting to mitigate the risks by implementing appropriate controls. And it doesn't mean that we will be terminating the risks. It means that we also think about the business needs. For example, the issues that we have, financials, human resources, capabilities. According to that, we will be implementing the appropriate controls, not just implementing a control to mitigate the risk. So supply chain continuity management also safeguards the business needs, business expectations, rather than making you keep spending money, or I can say wasting money maybe. Improved planning, due diligence, just like we discussed before, assurance and working relationships with suppliers, of course. And if we are implementing a systematic approach for our supply chain continuity management, especially following internationally recognized or known standards and frameworks, then we will definitely have a competitive advantage. It can even turn into a marketing advantage for business or for customers. Okay, now going to a little bit more technical areas, what we are expecting to implement in a supply chain continuity management. Now, this diagram is taken from business continuity management, and in fact, it is customized for supply chain continuity management. First of all, we will be starting with a business impact analysis or risk assessment. The sequence here may vary, may change. Following that, we will be building our supply chain continuity strategies and solutions. This is basically the one that we have just discussed, mitigating the risk. So what can be a high-level idea when we face with a disruption? And this idea will turn into a more detailed step-by-step approach, considering the time also, supply chain continuity plans and procedures. So this is the one that will help us to be prepared for any kind of disruption, even the scenarios that we could not foresee, because in a supply chain continuity plan, we are not looking for what can go wrong, we are looking for what can be achieved. Or we don't have them based on specific scenarios, we have the supply chain continuity plans based on activities, actions. So even there will be an incident that we cannot foresee, we could not think about it, just like the COVID-19. Many organizations were not prepared for a global pandemic, which is understandable, in fact, but still, we don't need to know the exact scenario. We can be prepared for any incident that's happening, and by collecting the correct service supply chain continuity plan from the shelf, we can respond to this disruption. Of course, an important part of supply chain continuity, just like the business continuity itself, exercising our plans. Okay, now this is another explanation of what we have just discussed. This is more relevant to the relations of these processes between them in a more detailed approach. I will just go quickly on the titles here. We need to gather the relevant information, because feeding our supply chain continuity with a factual data is a success factor, in fact. Then we need to define our organizational approach. What are we trying to achieve? Can we use alternatives? Or instead of using a supplier, for example, can we use our internal resources? Can we replace a supplier with that? We need to conduct the analysis that can be part of business impact analysis, in fact, focusing on the supply chain continuity. And the output of the analysis will be used to develop supply chain continuity management strategies. Okay, as we can see, this is the left one is the analysis part, and on the right one, we come up with the solutions, which are also including supply chain continuity plans that will be helpful to respond to any disruption on our way. Okay, on the next one, I would like to discuss about the challenge to an effective supply chain continuity management. I believe these are the ones commonly experienced by almost every organization. Let's go briefly through them. the distance and visibility of suppliers in the supply chain. This is one of the risks, in fact, what we are facing in UAE. As we may not be having most of the, let's have an example on the raw materials, we need to carry them from overseas, in fact. So we will have a very limited visibility on what's going on. So until the incident arrives us, cause a disruption, we may not see it's coming. Persuading suppliers to participate openly and transparently, because SCCM adds value to the relationship. The reason here, I will give some specific examples. Organizations want to have more control and more understanding, knowing our suppliers. There are different ways, different methodologies for doing that. For example, auditing a supplier is one of these, participating their exercises, or simply asking for their certificates, relevant international certificates, so that we can build a trust between them. Some suppliers might be quite conservative on that one, and they may decline any request coming from their customers. And especially if this supplier is the other challenge here, single and sole source supplier, we may have nothing to do on that one. Our hands might be tied. Another reason, the supplier can be a giant organization compared to the customer. So the customer may not really stress or force the supplier to share this information with them. If we don't have this data, we will be having a missing information for our risk management. So of course, the supply chain continuity is based on the managing the suppliers. We don't have the data from them, so our risk management would not be expected to be an effective one, unfortunately. Okay, inflexible contract relationship is part of that discussion, in fact. Let's move to the different regulatory requirements for the organization and the supplier, not maybe in the same country, but again, in the context of UAE, I believe that will be quite appropriate to talk. The suppliers that we are having in the different countries, they may be liable against different regulations, different legislations. So we may need to align with them on that regulations, or we may need to force them to embed or to follow, to comply with our local regulations. That can be another issue when it comes to relations between suppliers in overseas, different continents, different regions. Difficulty in identifying indirect impacts, such as when the lost one supplier makes another supplier critical. This is also a missing information in our risk management itself, so it may result with a catastrophic consequence. I would also want to say that risk management is an important part to have a robust business continuity plan, supply chain continuity plan. So having missing information at the beginning may result with a butterfly effect. So all our entire supply chain continuity management may collapse as we don't have accurate, timely information, the factual data. So another and the last challenge here, difficult understanding the full cost of disruption. This will again affect our risk management, the risk levels. So it will affect our decision-making capability. But on the other slide, we can also discuss about the essentials of supply chain management, what we need to be careful and what are the steps that we might be implementing. Top management, of course, will be again in the heart of our supply chain continuity management, just like all many other management systems. If top management hands are not on the supply chain continuity, we may not get the expected feedback, we may not get the expected support in means of resources, for example, and top management, as they are known the final decision makers, we may not take the steps to make decisions. Especially, we will see the effect of top management in supply chain strategies that we are building that will help us to have supply chain continuity plans. To set the priorities and standards required, we may not need to implement the supply chain continuity to the entire supply chain process. This may not be needed, and this is not a requirement also. We may prioritize the products and services that we will be implementing supply chain continuity management, and in time, we can extend the scope of that. And of course, while doing that, while doing this implementation, the international standards will be quite helpful instead of finding our own way. You know what they say, a smart person learns from his or her mistakes, but a wise person learns from everyone's mistakes. And the standards are the results of everyone's mistakes, in fact. So it is strongly recommended to get benefit from them. To allocate resources for conduct the analysis, the resources are not only from the procurement department. Resources can be from any department within the organization that has a touch point with the supply chain management. So our project team, let's call them, our project team might be covering not only the scope that we have chosen, but it may be covering the entire organization. So we may have especially human resources, subject matter experts from any process within the organization. Okay, evaluation, a continued evaluation is the first step of continued improvement. To evaluate the impact of supply chain or individual supplier failure on the organization's high priority activities, as we have prioritized them, thanks to our business impact analysis, and analysis to understand the organization's supply chain and the risk to organization arising from its disruptions, application of appropriate continuity strategies to each supplier. This is a good practice. We may have a single strategy for entire supply chain management, but the recommended one is to have strategies for each supplier. And these strategies will lead to multiple supply chain continuity plans, again for each supplier. So it will help us to have a more focused approach. But this is, of course, based on the resources that we have, like financial, human, and time also. Procedures for confirming that suppliers have appropriate continuity measures in place. If we remember in the previous slide, that was one of the challenge. Some suppliers are quite conservative, quite closed. They don't want to share any information with us. So if we have transparent suppliers, that can be one of the criteria when choosing the supplier, in fact, then yes, we can share, we can have information sharing between them, and we can also be familiar with their procedures. Because the idea here is that is another challenge of supply chain management. We are not managing it within our organization. We are also relying to another entity, a different organization. So our supply chain strategies and the supply chain continuity plans coming after them, they need to be integrated with the supplier to be successful. If our strategy is not choosing an alternative supplier, if our strategy is continuing with the same supplier, we need to see an integration. But if we don't see these other organizations, our suppliers' plans, strategies, then this integration may not be possible. So when the time comes, when the disruption arrives, our supply chain continuity plan, unfortunately, would fail. So a program for supply relationship management, this is implementing supply chain continuity management also based on known standards, international standards, and a long-term strategy to build a more resilient supply chain. Supply chain is taken under organizational resilience, just like as Mr. Talal's presentation. It is part of the organizational resilience. It cannot be taught as a separate one from that. And yes, in our overall organizational resilience strategy, supply chain resilience will be one of an important component here, as today we are having a connected world, in fact. Okay, some recommendations here. Let me list them. Improve international interagency compatibility of resilience standards and programs. Again, we talked about that in the last few slides. We need to have our programs based on tested, well-known, and the results of everyone's mistakes, standards, and frameworks. That will simplify the way that we are going through a supply chain continuity management, and we will not be learning from our own lessons, in fact. Okay. More explicitly, assess supply chain and transport risk as part of procurement, management, and governance process. Now, risk management is not a one-off activity. Risk management, in many well-known standards, is required to be done at planned intervals, but these may not be enough because our risk register is a live document. So it is, again, relevant to the context of the organization. But if we are that much lucky to have risk management professionals within our organization, we are expecting them to assess the risks in a continuous approach. This can even include, thanks to using the growing technologies like artificial intelligence, like machine learning, a 24/7 evaluation, assessment of risks, in fact. If that is possible, that's what we need to do. If not possible, with manual processes, we need to assess the risks as frequently as we can. So I will have another suggestion other than this sentence here. We can use, for example, horizon scanning process as an input to our risk management. That's also a trending topic in the world. This can help us to have a timely and accurate, correct data to feed our risk management. The other one is developing trusted networks of suppliers, customers, competitors, and government focused on the risk management. Okay, and the next one is improve network risk visibility. This is again relevant to transparency of our suppliers, so that our risk management can never be 100% accurate. For risk management, this is not possible because risk always involves uncertainty. However, we can mitigate the risk of an ineffective risk management. How? If we improve network risk visibility. So if we understand the world around us, if we understand the risks of our suppliers and what is going on the regions. So even we might be operating from UAE, if we are having suppliers in different regions, different continents, the risks belong to these continents also become our risks. So we need to think in this context, in fact. Okay, and the last one here, improve pre and post-event communication. Communication is a very important part of business continuity management, thus supply chain continuity management. So a robust communication can help us, even we are not well prepared for a disruption, to cope with that disruption, overcome this disruption. But a poor communication can result with, even we are having a very robust, excellent, let me call it, planning, it may collapse down because of a poor communication. So this is also another additional recommendation that I will be adding here. Exercising is an important part to understand if our plans will be working or not during or after disruption. So recommendation is exercising communication infrastructure more frequently than your supply chain continuity plans. They are quite easy to exercise. It is just saying hi and getting a response. And this is why we can do it more frequently, as they will have a huge impact in an adverse or beneficial way to our supply chain continuity management. Okay, I am also coming through the end of my presentation. At that part, I would like to introduce you some international standards. Now, first of all, there are in fact these two of them specifically relevant to supply chain management. These are all from International Organization of for Standardization, as you know, a non-profit organization that has international standards globally accepted, not recognized, accepted, because they go through a voting process before they are published, in fact. ISO 28000 series, this year we are expecting to have the new editions of them. This is focusing on supply chain security management. We have the requirement standard, and you can also get benefit from the best practices, which also includes some of these challenges, recommendations that I have presented in my webinar. And also 28002, it is focusing on the development of resilience in the supply chain. Following that, we also have a standard under 22300 family, the business continuity management system family, which is again focusing on supply chain, guidelines for supply chain continuity. Most of the information that you have seen during the webinar, in fact, driven from ISO 22318, and also customized for the purpose of this webinar. And the other one, as we discussed, supply chain continuity is an important part of organization resilience. We can think of organization resilience as an umbrella, and an important part will be supply chain continuity. So we first need to build the organization resilience strategy. So linking supply chain continuity with that overall strategy would be a preferred approach, in fact. This is why, in order to have an organization resilience approach, ISO 22316 standard will be helpful for any organization in the world. I also want to add that these standards are not for a specific sector or specific industry. They are applicable to any organization, regardless of type, size, or nature, because this non-profit organization, ISO, aims to help the entire world, not only focusing on a specific industry, especially with these standards, I can say. Okay, I would like to thank you for your time again, and we'll have over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Mr. Karsad, for your amazing presentation. It's definitely well noted. I'd like to invite the speakers to to go into some questions. Mr. Talal. All right. So we basically have our first question, from the audience, from Ammar. Because of the COVID supply chain impact, many organizations are now looking to source locally. Do you see this decreasing the supply chain risk in the future? We'll start with Talal.
I think the question should be, why didn't that organization look into the local supplier initially? If we had that option and it's the same quality, it's timely, it's a timely service, and it's a quality company, why did we go overseas in the first place? Why don't we consider the overseas as the secondary one and the local one as the primary, or vice versa? It all depends on the industry, depends on the actual product. But I think it's very important that you identify that is available locally. And if there's a change in the quality that's required, I'm sure that manufacturer can also support your needs if possible.
Well noted. Kursat?
Yes, I would like to say that that is, of course, a significant decision, in fact. We know that risk management is the driver for the decision making. Informed decisions are done through risk management. So I would recommend that not just only thinking one dimension of the risk, like localization because of COVID-19 or any other communicable disease risk. We also need to look for the risks in the business. So this decision making should not be based on a single dimension of the risk. We also need to think about other interested parties, advantages, and also the opportunities that we are having in the overseas. So we cannot just recommend to have it in the localization. This must be evaluated in the context of the organization's risk, in fact.
Well noted. Thank you for your answers. Our next question is from Mr. Sachin Kumar. Generally, while implementing business continuity program, one of the key hurdle of SPOF on a critical supplier, for example, Etisalat for telecom or any government entity for police clearance. So the question is how to handle contingency of resiliency when you can't have a memorandum of understanding or stuck with the only option. Talal?
So I hope I understood the question right. I think it's, just correct me if I'm wrong, Suzanne. Is it around stakeholder management and involving them in the process and how they can maybe hinder the process? Is that the question? If we're talking about police, for example?
No, I think that if I can try to explain, is the concept of having a single point of failure, which you cannot avoid. And this is one of the major issues that we are having in the Middle East, like the key telecom providers. So basically, we don't have or other situation like this. So what's
in some cases, yeah, I think in some cases, if you don't have alternatives, you might need to just accept the risk and ensure you have mitigations in place. You want to be flexible, you want to be dynamic, but you also have some limitations from other companies. It's the same with other organizations. I think what's important, what exactly is the single point of failure? And can you procure, or can you get another secondary source as a backup? And maybe not put all the bandwidth on the other other supplier. I'll give you an example. The aviation client that I was talking to you about, they use walkie-talkies. They have two types of systems with two separate vendors with two separate networks. One is based on VHF, and the other is based on SIM cards that comes from the telecom provider. So if one fails, they have an alternative. And they have dispatched units of these devices across the whole organization. So it's purely a backup, one to the other. Maybe that's something you can think about. There are solutions for some of the for some of the solutions, for some of the single points of failure.
Yeah, I think also that this is a classical situation where the transfer of risk should become one of the options, transferring maybe to insurance, having a proper business interruptions insurance to cover the situation.
Well, no,
By the way, this is not coverage, but is an option.
for sure, absolutely. Kursad, you wanted to add?
Yes, what Mr. Carlos said also, it's also a corrective control when we have the insurance. That's one of the options. But I also agree with Mr. Talal. I mean, the risks that we cannot mitigate, even it's a single point of failure are high, we need to accept them. But I would like to say from my experience with other organizations, especially in the UAE, these single point of failures, honestly, in working with many government entities, in their risk register, I don't remember any risk which is above the risk acceptance criteria linked with this single point of failure of the organizations because of well infrastructures, because of world class, or even going beyond the world class implementations of the government entities help many organizations to mitigate these risks. So yes, we have single point of failures, but I believe the risks within the context of UAE, we can say we are lucky to be here. So they are mostly low, below the risk acceptance criteria.
Yes and not, if I can. Working in a manufacturing company, for example, there is one of the key issues is the power grid, which is owned by Transco. And this is by one of the major single point of failure, which you cannot avoid. And there is no way to mitigate. And that's it. You have to live with this.
Yeah. I mean, the likelihood of these disruptions to happen is low, thanks to the structure of these organizations. In fact, so yes, we have the risk. We cannot avoid them. We may not even implement controls to mitigate them, as they are SPOF, but still, the risk that we calculate, they look like below the threshold. That can be the advantage. But I totally agree. Yeah.
I agree with you 100%.
If I might chime in, what about incorporating a plan, like if not a short-term plan, at least a long-term plan until the risk itself is mitigated? Would that be possible?
It depends. It should be assessed at the organization by organization. You cannot make a general rule on this.
Well noted. We have a next question. How do you see ESG risks and its impact to supply chains impacting the financial sector? I believe this one's addressed to Talal.
Very interesting question. Although I'm not an ESG expert, and I'm not an expert in the financial sector. But when you think about it, ESG is linked to any industry. So you can talk about financial sector and the emissions that are coming out of the generators, backup generators for the data center. You can talk about to what extent are you emitting CO2 in your data centers. So that's one small element when you talk about the environment. But ESG is not just about environment. It's the whole spectrum of what you can embed and implement across. If you have any specific questions in the financial sector, please drop me a note. I can get you in touch with a more competent person when we talk about ESG. Maybe Karl or Prasad, you have more knowledge than I do to support the answer.
For ESG, honestly, I am also not an expert, so I don't want to misguide anyone by that. So yeah, I'll pass that.
Okay.
ESG is becoming more and more one of the major topic with the risk managers. And more and more we as a risk manager are involved in assessment related to ESG. I think this could be a very good topic for another webinar.
For sure, definitely. We have another question. What should be my approach for taking insurance to secure my supply chain? Talal?
Very, very good question. So there are multiple types of insurance policies that can support your overall supply chain. It's clear to understand what current policies you have in place. It's clear to understand what are your risks that you're facing today from a supply chain perspective. And it's very important to understand what of those risks are insurable risks. Not everything is insurable. We talk about business interruption insurance, where many industries have it in place and they actually invest in it. It's very important. So I think it's important to go back a step, understand what are the risks, understand which are insurable and which are not insurable, because some cases you cannot transfer the risk of certain elements. And they have the combination of a cyber attack impacting, for example, a manufacturing plant. Is it covered under business interruption or not? Those are questions that are key and important to understand and know what is your actual coverage. Of course, any more details on the types of insurance and how a broker or an insurance company can support, please feel free to drop me a note. I can get you in touch with the right people and make sure they help you with at least the effective decision making or effective knowledge around the area.
Well said. Well said. Kursad, you want to add something?
Yes, sure. Supply chain continuity, in fact, needs to be taken as in a holistic approach. I believe what again I have experienced, many organizations start focusing on the procurement department only and limiting with that. In fact, supply chain continuity or supply chain security management reads beyond the procurement, beyond the acquisition, beyond the purchasing. So it touches, for example, human resources. With the new wave, the digitalization, digital transformation, it touches to IT also. So this is why, just like in my presentation I mentioned, it should be driven from the top management itself. It should be a concern in the agenda of top management. What are our supply chain security risks? Of course, the subject matter experts will support that, but the top management need to cascade it to the entire organization to ensure this holistic approach and ensure that there is an integration between other departments to have a defense to protect our supply chain as a whole organization, not focusing only a single department. This is why a management system that covers, that touches to all the different parts of the organization will be suggestible for a robust supply chain security and continuity.
Well said. I think for the sake of time, we'll just try to answer the remaining questions. Does the current geopolitical scenario at Strait of Harmos create any major threats to supply chain capabilities within the UAE, as this is one of the most critical sea routes for the UAE to the world? Talal?
I think a very important question. I would say there's always a risk. The political arena today is on high risk. It's important to know what exactly are the goods that are moving in that area and how is that impacting you as an organization. So you need to identify what exactly is going through that area that will impact you, because it's important to speak about your own organization and do step by step, because you have other people responsible for doing it at the macro level, at the government level. But it's important for you to know, can I source it locally? Either if it's a raw material or some important part to your supply chain. And of course, you have to think about, if you're exporting goods, is there alternative ways to export? You need to think about other customers. You need to think about becoming dynamic. You need to think about storage. So it all depends on the actual industry. But of course, it is a key risk, and it has to be on the top radar of many organizations.
Okay.
Agree.
Definitely. Kursad?
Yeah, I would like to say also, when we are looking at the risk, the geopolitical risk, we also need to focus on the opportunities, the beneficial side of that. That would also help us to mitigate the adverse risks that Mr. Talal also listed, and also we can harness the opportunity of being in this area, as if it is not possible to move our organization. In fact, so many organizations are skipping that, which is a vital or fatal, let's call it, mistake. In fact, they are doing. We also need to pursue the opportunities. So we need to take the risk as two sides of the same coin, like the positive and the negative ones. So I believe organizations, if they focus on that one also, that will help to mitigate the threats, which are the negative risks.
Okay, well noted. I believe, we're almost out of time. We do have 2 more questions, but we promise you we will forward the questions to our speakers today. Would like to thank everyone. Actually, number one, would like to thank our guest speakers for taking the time of their day and to, at least especially after working hours in the UAE, to provide such wonderful presentations. And of course, special thanks to my colleague Carlo as a BCI UAE chapter member for the big support. And of course, number one, special thanks to Miss Kirsty Wise, who's the BCI UK's coordinator, who has helped us arrange for this webinar. We thank you so much. And we just want to remind everyone that there is actually a handout attached within this webinar that actually has the contact detail, for LinkedIn. I don't know if anybody can see my screen. Can you? Yeah. So so basically, everyone, thank you for attending. You can contact us directly through our LinkedIn profiles. For whether it's to our speakers, to myself, to Mr. Carlo, to Mr. Talal, to Mr. Karsad. You can easily reach us in case of any questions, any inquiries, any knowledge sharing, or any information you might have had from the very beginning of the session, and maybe you might want to ask later on after the webinar or the next couple of days. Please feel free to contact us. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar, and thank you everyone. And we hope that you basically have benefited from today's webinar. Thank you guys so much. And again,
I just wanted to say thank you, Susan, for your great job. You did, as always, absolutely stunning. Thank you so much. Great.
Thank you so much, Carlo. It definitely means a lot. We're one team in the end of the day. And, we're all here to support each other. It doesn't matter what expertise, in the end of the day, knowledge is definitely power. And this knowledge can benefit anybody and everyone, whether it's coming from, the biggest organizations to a smaller organizations. And what we witnessed from the beginning of the COVID-19, businesses have been impacted, projects have been impacted. A lot of people have have lost their jobs because of the COVID. And now we need to be more prepared, more resilient, specifically, especially in supply chain itself, to be, to be more stronger, in our programs, be more stronger in our procedures. Definitely. And thank you guys so much. And inshallah, we hope to see everyone from the audience again in our next upcoming webinar, and we'll be basically posting very soon. So stay tuned, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, guys.